and Loma Linda. So when next we go to Loma Linda, we have to
honored guests here.
Oh, yeah. Members gone astray.
I think, Tom, you want to introduce Aloretta? Welcome. It's so nice to have you with us. The trouble is, when we stop, we don't know where to stop because then we have Mr. Shaw's son and wife here too. So today, are you ready, sir?
Yes. Oh, wait a minute. Yes, quick. That should do it. There you go.
Well, today we're supposed to study the story of Elijah and Ahab. Elijah was the prophet. Ahab was the king. He was king of Israel 874 BC. And essentially, I've structured the lesson study around these 6 questions. What is the story? Who were the characters? Questions 3 and 4 together. What was their world like and how did they relate to their world? And then what lessons and insights and takeaways about the characters can we have? And I'm going to ask you to break up in small groups and talk about that for a little bit. And then the last 2 questions is where I'm going to venture out a little bit, and I hope it works. Stay a prayer for me. How do Christians relate to our world? And how should we relate to our world as Seventh-day Adventist Christians? And finally, what lessons do we take away from this whole discussion about ourselves and about God? So that's the lesson study. And so we'll move on. First 2 questions. What is the story and who are the characters in the story? So what's the story? Anybody? You've all read the 7 chapters, 1 Kings 17 to 22. What's the story? Highlights of the story. Anybody?
Apostasy of a nation.
The apostasy of a nation. Okay, that's a nice summation. Someone wants to break it out a little bit?
Elijah defeats.
Sorry?
Elijah defeats.
Elijah of Carmel, and Elijah defeats the prophets of Baal. What started it? Ahab is king. Well, let's move on a little bit then. Characters. Who are the main characters in the story?
Ahab, Elijah, Jezebel. Jezebel was a problem.
Ahab, Elijah. Who else?
Jezebel.
Jezebel.
Does anybody have a daughter?
Yeah, I was just thinking. Nobody's ever used that.
She ruined that name, didn't she? How unfortunate. What else we have?
Prophet the Baal.
Yeah, right. Yeah, thank you.
Prophet the Baal.
Not so much better.
I think
Try this one.
There's a red
who else? We have a couple of others that we're leaving out.
Do you include God as a character?
Well, okay, yes.
Obadiah.
Obadiah. Widow of Zarephath. Yeah, sure. I don't know if I can spell Zarephath.
That's Terry.
Oh, that's right. Anyone else? One more. Naboth. Anybody remembers what's the piece of the story with Naboth?
Yeah. Then there's a whole bunch of people.
Yeah.
The children, we're
I'm going to call them the 7,000.
yeah, there's whatever you want to call them. But there's a lot of
They were unnamed, but yet they're very important in the story. And then the last chapter.
Yeah, I'll try
It's
that.
red look better.
I'll go to Office Depot this week.
There we go.
Abel's son. Let's not mix it. Okay, so those are the characters. As I recall them, I went through and I think we've covered it all in terms of the story. And the story is Ahab marries Jezebel. Actually, his father Omni arranges the marriage, and we'll talk about that in a while. And she comes from a different neck of the woods. And she has a different worship system. She's worshiping Baal, which is the name for a lot of other gods that they were contending with. She brings that into the country. And she has 400 prophets of Baal and 450 prophets of Ashtoreth or something so, which is a fertility goddess. And they're trying to change the culture of the country of Israel. And then Elijah, this guy, who is a kind of a little bit of a weirdo, lives by himself. He's a little bit of an insular, isolate, shows up and he says, you know what, you guys are going in the wrong direction. No more rain here for 3.5 years. And he disappears for 3.5 years and there's no rain and things get very difficult. And then he shows up and he says, you know what? If your God is really the true God, you should be able to make rain fall. If not, Yahweh will make rain fall. So let's meet on Carmel and have a showdown. Straight case. Whoever is the right God will win and whoever is not. And so they meet. Didn't have rain. Elijah prays, he gets rain. They kill the 450 prophets of Baal. We need to talk about that. And then Jezebel says, you know what, by tomorrow morning, you will be like one of those 450. And he disappears, runs all the way down into southern part of it, of Palestine there. And then God shows up and says, what are you doing here? Finally, the still small voice of God speaks to Elijah. And Elijah comes back. And that's kind of like the end of the story, except Abel, there's a little addendum, so to speak. Ahab wants Naboth's vineyard. Naboth said he can't sell the vineyard. Jezebel says, no problem. She cooks up a story that Naboth was not loyal, that they stoned him to death, and she said, go take the vineyard. Elijah shows up and he says, listen, the same way the dogs, he bled to death from the stoning, you, Jezebel, the dogs are going to eat you up there. And it happens. And then their son, Azariah, the last one, was ill, and he seeks some other God to tell him what the future of his health will be. And Elijah shows up and says, you know what, because you did that, you're going to die. And that's the end of the story. Terry takes it from there next week. So that's the story. Those are the characters. So the question is, what was their world like? And how did they relate to their world? So look at it. Solomon was the last king of a united kingdom. And then after Solomon, it broke into two. Judah, yellow, Israel, the other tribes to the north in blue. And if you could see carefully up to the top on the coast, the Sidon, that's where Jezebel came from. And the whole battle was with all these kings. Obviously, the kings who were in the north, in the blue state, they wanted to break away and create their own independence. That was what their world was like. From Judah, which is in the yellow state. Their problem was Jerusalem was in the yellow state, and the temple that David and Solomon built was in the yellow state. So religion was a problem for them because it was bringing the people together. It meant that the tribes in the blue state had to go once a year to worship in Jerusalem because that was where the temple was. And from a political point of view, that didn't suit the kings of the north very well. So what did they do? It was really politically tempting to bring in another god, create temples, create sites of worship, to bring in a whole priestly set of people so they could forge and shape the independence of Israel from Judah. Even though they were related and they were members of the same family historically, each man wanted to carve the independence of his kingdom. That's the world in which they lived. And that's how they related to the world. They were family, but they were seeking independence, and religion was the basis on which they could try to create an independent culture in their world. That was the appeal of Baal. Now, there was a dispute in those days, whether there was really one God or whether there were many gods. And so it was relatively easy for them to introduce and support Baal, because it helped to foster the independence of the northern part of the Jewish nation. Can you imagine how God must have felt? And can you imagine how the prophets who represented God felt, where they watched human beings politically motivated try to separate so they could consolidate their own political power, and to give up their religion to consolidate their own political power? That's the world and how they related to the world. So they were, I just said it. So then, here comes Elijah. And he shows up. And in essence, Elijah is saying, you guys are making a mistake. We should be one, not two separate nations. We should worship one God, the true God. And we've reviewed the story, and you know the story. So what I'd like you to do at this point is turn to 3 or 4 of you, whichever is convenience, for the next few minutes. What insight, lesson, or takeaway about the characters, primarily Elijah, but you could go to Ahab, you could pick any one of these characters that you want to talk to, and then we'll come back and you're going to share them with me. So go right ahead, organize, just turn to whoever is near. There was a man of like passions as we are. But he isn't the only one who shows weakness. Every one of us does in one way or another. The weakness of human frailty. That text that says, be careful, take heed where you stand, lest you fall. Thank you very much. Someone else.
There's hope for glass half empty people. Because God came to him when his glass was half empty in a still small voice.
I think it shows the consistency of human nature. Nothing changes.
People.
Who was saying, sorry? You were saying consistency?
Back here.
Oh, boys. Hey, the guy back here made a comment. I thought you heard.
What was it?
I was saying it shows the consistency of human nature. It's like nothing changes. We never learn.
I think it's called our humanity.
In other words, we are still the same way today as we were back then.
Yeah.
But do we hear that small voice? Are we attentive enough to hear the voice? God didn't speak in lightning and thunder, except at the altar where they brought the fire down, but when he was talking to Elijah, how subtle and how discreet was that voice of God?
Take a left, sir. Take a left, sir.
I'm sorry.
Yeah, I think one of the big things that is coming out here is it's a word that we been using yesterday, the importance of character.
The importance of
Character. Nabal was a very poor leader, he lacked maturity, decisiveness, consistency, strength, and courage. Consequently, Jezebel control and manipulate him for the I think it's someone wants to have one in here.
importance of character, the difference a leader makes, shaping the country. Hang yes,
I think this is a major story of hope for all of us.
amazing.
A major story of hope for all of us through all of the ages, because he shows his humanity, the man of the greatest faith, prophet, the greatest faith, that shows his humanity, that he's a human, not a god, and he has all the foibles and struggles that all the rest of us has, and he gets lifted up in spite of all of that, which we all will do, hopefully, through his faith. And that's the story that everybody should take.
And it's our story. It's more than the story of Ahab and Elijah. It's the story of humanity. And it says something about the God that we serve, who is patient, accepting, and supportive of us.
I think one of the things that's interesting is I believe that Elisha, to a degree, had a level of respect in terms of awareness of Jezebel's influence. And in his moment of weakness, one of the scriptures that I love is we're made strong through him, through our moments of weakness. And what I love about this whole experience is even in Elijah's moment of weakness, he was visited by the angel of the Lord, some would call the pre-incarnate Jesus, and he made cakes for him. So, I mean, how much more of a blessing can you see God's love, that he stands by you, nourishes you, even in your moment of weakness, and then re-empowers you. And I believe he made cakes for him twice.
Courage from God.
Yeah.
So I will point out, hang on a minute, I will point out that life is not a fairy tale. There are people who lost their lives. And there are people who lose their lives today by standing for principle. It's not always end with a happy ending. So Elijah's fear is not just an imaginary fear. I mean, it is a fear based on real stuff. And we don't quite understand. That's why faith is a choice. Like some people live and some people die, standing for principle.
In a practical sense, timing is key for leaders. And Elijah comes to the conclusion that he's all God has to do God's work. And God has to explain to him, no, there's 7,000 other folk here, and I've got faithful people. And then God said to him, because you kind of got a little different view, I need to have you go anoint some new leaders. Time for you to retire. You've done it well. Well, you go find Elisha and you anoint Elisha.
There's a time.
Find some king. And it's very interesting that as powerful as Elijah was, he got discouraged because he thought it was all up to him.
Temptation of leaders. Find someone else. Yes.
So on another note, another cause for hope and insight about God is the end of chapter 21 where Ahab repents. When Elijah comes to Ahab and said, God's going to take away every descendant you've got, everyone related to you is going to be eaten by dogs. Ahab repents. He put on sackcloth and ashes, he fasted, and God came to Elijah and said, have you noticed how Ahab has humbled himself before me? Because of this, I'm not going to do this to him. So, wow.
That was because Jezebel was dead.
Yeah, we could meet him in
Lauren, you're picking on the poor woman.
Dog did.
I actually like the sense of humor. You don't see humor a lot, but God allowed Elijah to make fun of the prophets of Baal. You're not yelling loud enough, speak louder. He really went after them, and that was nice to see humor.
Maybe sometimes in the religious world, we don't have room for humor.
Right.
And it's good to have a touch. I want to move the lesson on. Is there anything we missed? Look at what you did. You taught the class this morning. I just facilitated it. Run.
Just one comment. When Elijah goes to Zarephath, he is going to Jezebel's
Hometown.
hometown.
Yep.
Essentially. Where would Jezebel go looking for Elijah? Probably not in her hometown. And sometimes I think we try to just do things. Sometimes I think Elijah was very intelligent by going there, because that's not where he was going to be looked for. And sometimes we need to be thoughtful of the choices that we make in time of crisis.
Appreciate that. One last comment and then I got to move on.
It struck me the relationship that God illustrates his working with nature to fulfill his promises and his commitment. Not only the fire coming down, but he told the birds to go feed Elijah.
Ravens, which normally don't feed anyone but themselves.
He stopped the rain, and then brought the rain. We forget how God relates through nature.
To the world, actually.
Nature listens. We don't.
I found this little book. Thank you. I found this little book very interesting. It's about the turn of the century, Hamilton Smith. I just want to share two thoughts and then we need to move on. He says on Elijah's obedience, God tells him, go away and hide. And then God comes back to him and says, now show yourself. And he says Elijah must spend 3.5 years in hidden seclusion with God before he sends him for one day in prominence with the king. And he ties it to Moses having to be in seclusion for 40 years before he assumes leadership and preparation. And then he says, and this is what I want to share with you, he talks about life's dry season. If you recall, the brook dries up. And he says, we have to face the brook that dries up, as Elijah did. In different forms, it crosses our path, perhaps by bereavement, or by a breakdown of health, or by the sudden failure of some source of supply. We find ourselves beside the brook that dries up. It is well if in such moments, rising above the ruin of our earthly hopes, the failure of human props, we can by faith in the living God accept all from him. The very trial we shall find to be the means God is using to unfold to us the vast resources of his heart of love and lead our souls into deeper, richer blessing than we have ever known. It's a choice by faith. So let's go on. I want to raise it now from the history to our life today. How do Christians relate to the world today? We've just reflected on how they related to the world back then in AD 900, BC 900, and how Elijah, as the prophet of God, related. How do Christians relate to the world today? So here is a classic in theology, written back in the 1960s, 1951, so it's 70 odd years old, where Niebuhr, who was a theologian, he was Episcopalian, I think, United Church. He taught at Yale for about 30 years, and he wrote this classic in Christian literature. He says, what is culture? The last paragraph. It is the social life of humanity, the environment created by human beings in areas of language, habits, ideas, beliefs, customs, social organization, inherited artifacts, technical processes, and values. So we have what we could call today an American culture. And we have what we could call a Caribbean culture, which is where I come from, a European culture. And then you could subdivide it into the different countries with their habits and their way of life. And the question is, how should Christians, and for our class, how should Seventh-day Adventist Christians relate to culture? So Nebo spelled out three major approaches. The first one is Christ against culture. It's kind of like, that's the world, we have nothing to do with it, and we pull ourselves apart. And in a sense, Elijah's posture was like that. Culture was where it was, and he lived by himself. And God sent him to speak to that culture from time to time. Then the second position is we agree with the culture. So we immerse ourselves in the culture. It's a wonderful thing, and the culture is the right thing. Those are the two extremes. The challenging one is the middle one, Christ above culture, which is a combination that incorporates the two perspectives. And in a sense, within that third framework, you have some people say, you know what? There's good in the culture, there's bad in the culture, and it lives in tension. And we have to live between those two extremes and try to balance it off by using our judgment. So we look at some things, we enjoy some things, we involve ourselves in some things, and we leave ourselves out of some of those other things. There's a dualism. And then there is what is called the conversionism. There's good in culture, and our job as Christians is to change what is bad and make the culture better. So that's a thumbshell view, and I gave you the article to read. At least Lauren sent it out. If you haven't read it, you can read it and unpack it a little more. So the question is at the bottom, how should we relate to culture, to our culture today? Make it a little easy. Think of the Seventh-day Adventist Church and think of the organization now. So where is Advent Health? How does Advent Health relate to the culture? Which one of these positions would you say Advent Health takes?
It's smack dab in the middle of it every.
Smack dab in the middle. Tom.
So Sharon and I had an experience a number of years ago when we took over Advent Health took over the hospital in Ocala. And early on, we were at an event, I don't recall what it was, but there was a broad range of community people there. And two different community people came up to us and said, thank you for bringing Jesus back to our community. And it wasn't a coordinated thing, but two different people came and shared that.
Unsolicited, that is their perception. Elder.
Yeah, that's a good point. It occurs to me that in Advent Health is a blessing because it doesn't judge the culture.
It brings its values and its Christian perspective.
But everybody is respected.
And I have been in parts of the world where we say we have a church school and only Adventists should be in the church school. Or if we have people who are not Adventists, there shouldn't be more than 20%, otherwise it's not a church school. That's a different perspective on how we relate to culture. And every one of us has to ask that question and answer that question ourselves. Now we run the risk, like the children of Israel, just going along with the flow, like many of them did in the days of Ahab and Jezebel. Or we could be like the 7,000 thinking our way through in how we relate to culture. Lauren.
About a year ago, I wanted to play golf one Tuesday morning and I didn't have anybody to play with. So I went to a local golf course and said, hey, can I get out and play? And they said, yeah, see those three guys over there, you can go play with them. And so I joined them and they were really nice guys and we had a good time. At the end, they said, you know, one of our fourth guy had major surgery and he's not going to be able to play. Would you like to play with us? And so I said, sure. So every Tuesday since then, we meet and play golf, and Elmer has joined us as well on quite a few occasions. And eventually guys are on the tee box. Well, so what did you do before you retired? Well, I worked for Advent Health. Oh, are you a Seventh-day Adventist? Yes. Now, these three guys drop F-bombs all the time. And to my recollection, Elmer and I have never done that.
Come on, Elmer.
I may have topped the tee shot. It went 20 yards and I may have said, Lauren, you idiot.
More than once.
But you know, those guys know. And yeah, just the other day I was riding with the Jewish guy, Larry, and he said, you know, I really like you. You're a good guy. And to me, that was being in the culture, but not being changed by the culture.
Yeah, that what Warren just said was what I was thinking about. I think what I face, and I think a lot of other people face, is that you think that there's well, you know, from reading the Bible, there's a charge, right? You're to, if you believe, you're to let your light shine and help light up the world. But the question is, when you can do that, that's a life of leading a Christian life and letting light do the work. But then there's another step, and that is you can actually go to turn the light on in other people and be proactive. And the question for me is, how do you, when to go out to change, and whether just to let your light shine.
Which is the importance of judgment, discernment, and reflection. Correct. And there is no rule except you have to prayerfully make that call. When do you do it? But it's more than that too. This is a culture that is open, that gives us the freedom to do it. What about some cultures where you can't practice your Christian faith? How do you relate? How does a Christian relate in a culture where you are not able to openly confess your faith? What if there were a rule one day, good Adventist eschatology, that says all Christians As first point, does it say if you have to go on Sunday, you can't go on Saturday? Calvin?
The commandment doesn't say we have to go to church on Saturday. Because we have to. I could go to church on Sunday.
So if you read the little book written by Pastor Julie's father that Pastor Julie and the church passed out, it's about his experiences overseas, doing church work overseas. And most of it is about him going into countries that didn't allow Christianity or any work. And most of the book is about how they snuck in and out. And how, you know, they would pray and somebody they'd meet on the plane turned out to be an official who would help them sneak in and out. But in that case, they were defying, although not openly.
So notice what just happened. Terry said, if you could go to church on Saturday, there's nothing wrong in going to church on Sunday as well. Just go to both days. You haven't broken the law. Calvin says the commandment doesn't say you have to go to church at all. It says you just don't have to work. What's happening there? We're reasoning. We're trying to figure out an answer. Now think of the story. There were two characters, and I put a star by this one. Nobody mentioned him. Obadiah. Who was Obadiah?
Prophet.
He wasn't a prophet. He was the chief. He was the what?
Ahab's court.
He was in Ahab's court, working in Ahab's court. He had a position of authority. He was an executive in Ahab's court. How did he relate to the world of Ahab? And how was his relationship different from Elijah's relationship? Now, some have called in question Obadiah's loyalty to God. Some have called in question Obadiah's liability to God. I don't.
He wasn't confronted. It's kind of like Daniel living, in the culture. of
He
that.
was like Daniel, living in the culture that was not a culture supportive of the Judaic faith,
But he wasn't confrontive.
but he was practicing his religious faith. How do you know Obadiah was, sorry,
There's a text that says, if I be lifted up, I will draw all men to me. How do we lift him up? By the way we live.
right?
Isn't that the answer?
How do we know that Obadiah was a believer? What proof do we have, except for my assertion to you this morning, that Obadiah was a believer in Yahweh?
The prophets.
In the dialogue with
I'm sorry?
dialogue with Elijah.
I didn't hear you, Calvin.
It was his dialogue with Elijah.
His dialogue with Elijah. But the fact is, he protected 100 prophets of God. He protected them even while he was an official in the king's court, like Daniel. The point I'm trying to make is there are different ways. What happened to the screen?
Remember, I have to do it from this.
Oh, no, but I mean,
You ready to do the video?
no.
Oh, I'm sorry, Si.
I still want to put the thing up there. Yes. What I'm trying to say is there are different ways in which we relate to the culture in which we live, which means that we have to be sensitive and patient with each other. If Tom chooses one way, I don't question him and say, we have a tendency as Christians, is the point I want to make, to think in terms of black and white. Life is much more complex than just simply black and white.
There was a point, though, where though the heavens fall, I'm not going to bow down to you. The Hebrews, Daniel's friends.
There is a point at which you have to make that call, and you have to decide when is the time. And sometimes because of our human frailty, we may not make the right call. We have to accept that fact. But the fact is, it doesn't have to be in terms of black and white. Okay, one size is the point I want to make in answer to the question, how should we relate to our world? One size doesn't fit all. My answer to you is, it depends. And you have to think about what it is that makes it depend on. So Christians have different concerns. In 20th century America, where we live today, is different from 19th century Europe. It's different from the killing fields of Cambodia, and it's different from the present day rebellion and bloodshed that's taking place in Rwanda and southern Sudan. And so it depends, because that question has to be answered in the context of where you are, what you are doing, and an individual's own personality makeup. As you said very correctly, Obadiah was not confrontive. Elijah was. Think about that and what it tells us about God. So I want to talk a little bit about something else. I want to talk about a study that was done in 1961 by a gentleman by the name of Stanley Milgram. He was a Jew, and he was concerned about why did Christians in Germany go along with the whole Nazi issue? Why didn't they stand up? And he wanted to study how people relate to authority. And he did a study at Yale, and the idea was he would compare how Americans behaved to how Germans behaved. And the study was simply this, it was contrived. he invited people to come in for $4.50. They could spend an hour of their time in that day. And they would be either a teacher or a student. And in fact, what everybody who was really being tested was a teacher, but they didn't understand that. He deliberately set it up. And since then, there's been a lot of publications about the ethics of the study, etc. But the bottom line is, the student was part of the charade. And basically, the teacher was supposed to teach them memory, how to learn and remember. And it was set up so that when they made a mistake, they would be shocked. And there was a sign that says, after a certain level of wattage, it would cause pain and the person would eventually die. And so the student who was part of it wasn't happening, but the student would agonizing howls of pain, etc. And finally, as the wattage increased, till the student would finally pass out, so to speak, and there'd be no sound. And he wanted to see how many people would stop, how many people would listen. And so there was an authority figure sitting in the room, and people joked and they sweated and they struggled. But 2/3 of the people continued shocking until they thought the person had passed out or died. He never bothered to go to Germany because he came to the conclusion human nature is very fragile and responds to authority 2 out of every 3. I want to show you a clip, this clip of one of the subjects. We can make it happen.
Yeah, you get lucky.
Incorrect. You'll not get a shock of 105 volts. Hard hit. Just how far can you go with this thing? All right. Maybe as far as necessary. 8 feet. I sure don't know the effect of this thing, and I'm a little skeptical about electricity. Incorrect. 150 volts. Sad face. I think we have to find out what's wrong here. The experiment requires. Well, the experiment might require that we continue, but I still think we should find out what the condition of the gentleman is. As I said before, although the shocks may be painful, they're not dangerous. Look, I don't know anything about electricity. I don't profess any knowledge, nor will I go any further until I find out if the guy's okay. It's absolutely essential that you continue. Well, essential or not, this program isn't quite that important to me that I should go along doing something I know nothing about, particularly if it's going to injure someone. I don't know what this is all about. Well, whether the learner likes it or not, we must go on until the repairs is correct. You can sure have your 450 back. I didn't want it anyhow. I intend to get it some cattle organization, but I would probably put it. The 450 is not the issue here. That check is yours. I read it alive. It is essential to continue the experiment. No, you have no other choice. Oh, I have no other choice. My number one choice is that I wouldn't want it. I thought he'd pay for it.
I'm sorry you couldn't hear it, but he was one of those 3 that said he had choice. You keep your 450. I was going to give it away anyhow. I'm not going on. 1 out of 3. So without trying to be self-righteous, I'm looking at you and I'm saying 2/3 of you would probably follow the general pattern. And who are those? Like Jesus in the upper room, Lord, is it I? Only you can decide that. Here's the thing. Only those who live the values of the Christian faith and really internalize them. Like Micah said, act justly, love kindness, walk humbly. When we internalize those, we behave that way. Otherwise, we yield in our human frailty and authority. Paul says in Timothy, pursue righteousness, goodness, godliness, faith, love, patience. We are all psychologically vulnerable. That is what the experiment shows. He didn't have to go to Germany. He understood that human nature is the same wherever it is. We are psychologically vulnerable and prone to listen to authority. In 1971, another guy by the name of Philip Zimbardo, you could Google them and go on TED Talks. There's a gruesome prison experiment that he did that showed a similar thing with human beings acting as prison guards and as prisoners. And the prison guards, ordinary people like ourselves, became cruel and ruthless when the situation changed because of human vulnerability. And so today, well, we have it. What is the story? We've talked about that. Who were the characters? We reviewed them. What was their world like? We've discussed that. How did they relate to their world? We talked about our insights. We talked about how Christians relate today. And we talked about how we should relate. Finally, to conclude, I have two questions. What does this teach us about ourselves? And what does this lesson study teach us about God? I'd like to suggest teaches us that we often see things in black and white. But remember Elijah and Obadiah. Both of them responded to their situation differently, and they were both faithful to God. It teaches us to respect each other in spite of our differences. Don't resist the temptation to say, I am better than you because I did this and you failed to do the same thing that I did. That's one of the lessons for me. The other lesson is the frailty of human nature. Let him that standeth take heed, lest he fall. And what does it teach us about God? God finds ways to use us in spite of our weaknesses, to use us with our strengths. Elijah was used, but he was an obstreperous person. And he had his own shortcomings. I mean, imagine if I had a battle like Elijah. I don't have that personality, a confrontive one. And when we finished, I said, kill all of them, 450 of them. He was not a very tolerant individual, but God found a way to use his strengths and to minimize his weaknesses, as God can find a way to use our strengths and minimize our weaknesses. Remember Saul and Barnabas. Saul was a very conflicting fellow. And finally he said to Barnabas, John Mark wouldn't do, get rid of him. He's a weakling. I don't have any use for him. It was such a serious discussion in the book of Acts that Barnabas and Saul separated. It's interesting that John Mark ministered to Saul later on in his life. He was wrong, but God used him to proclaim the gospel. He used his strength and he minimized his weaknesses. Think about that. Think about Elijah and Obadiah, Paul and Barnabas. Just examples of how God can use an imperfect human being to use that person's strengths and to minimize their weaknesses. And finally, I just want to read in the remaining time a story that I came across that illustrates this point about someone that we probably all know. In a quiet pediatric wing of a San Francisco hospital in the late 1990s, a nurse paused outside a room, blinking back tears. Inside, a small boy with terminal cancer was doubled over in laughter. Dressed in scrubs, 3 sizes too big, with a stethoscope around his neck and a ridiculous red nose, Robin Williams had the child laughing so hard he momentarily forgot his pain. No cameras, no press, no entourage, only Robin doing voices, pulling faces, imitating cartoon characters, making joy out of thin air. Those visits were never scheduled through Hollywood. They were arranged quietly through hospital staff who had quietly come to know him as more than an actor or a comedian. He would often call ahead anonymously, asking if there were any children who might benefit from a visit. Many times he arrived alone, sometimes with a bag of puppets or dressed in character, even slipping into his iconic Mrs. Doubtfire voice. The children, some too weak to sit up, would smile, giggle, or whisper a joke back. Parents watched in awe as their child, often in the final days of life, laughed again, sometimes for the first time in weeks. One nurse recalled a 2003 visit when Robin spent over an hour with a 10-year-old leukemia patient who had only days left. The boy's father had been stoic for weeks, refusing to cry in front of his son. That day, as Robin pretended to conduct an invisible orchestra of squeaky 4 ivy poles and sang a ridiculous operatic ballad to the beeping of heart monitors, the man finally wept, not from grief, but from relief. Robin never spoke about those events in interviews. Even those closest to him, including longtime friends and collaborators, learned about them through others. Some families tried to thank him publicly, but he always declined. He believed the experience belonged to the child, not to him, certainly not to any public narrative. For Robin, the visit wasn't an act of charity or performance. It was a human connection, raw and unfiltered. God used him and his gift of humor to give hope and life, as God can use every one of us with our gifts in spite of our weakness. And there you have it, folks, the story of Elijah and Ahab. Let's bow our heads for prayer. Our Father in heaven, we thank you that you are our eternal refuge and that underneath are your everlasting arms. Give us insight and wisdom. Help us to use wisdom, your wisdom, to make the right judgment as how we relate to the world in which we live. May we find our gift and may we use it to bless others. And on that day, may we hear the words, well done. For we ask this in Jesus' name. Amen. God bless you.